50 million years ago, a landmass with nowhere left to go was still moving faster than almost anything else on the surface of the planet. India at that point wasn't attached to Asia at all. It was an island continent, torn loose from the ancient southern supercontinent of Gondwana, drifting north across an open sea at a pace that geologists still find slightly startling. Something on the order of 15 to 20 centimetres a year at its fastest, which sounds like nothing until you remember that most continental plates today creep along at something closer to 2 or 3 centimetres a year. The speed, roughly, at which your fingernails grow. India was sprinting, in geological terms, on a multi-million-year collision course with the southern edge of Asia, and there was nothing in its way to slow it down. Not yet. Consider the scale of that ancient journey properly. India, before it ever touched Asia, had already crossed thousands of kilometres of open ocean, carrying with it whatever plants and animals had managed to hitch a ride on an island continent, adrift for tens of millions of years, evolving in isolation the way island ecosystems always do, before the collision that was coming would eventually reconnect it to an entire continent's worth of competing life. None of that mattered to the rock itself, of course. The rock simply kept moving north, carried by forces operating on a timescale far too slow for anything alive to notice, until it finally arrived. When it finally arrived, it didn't stop so much as it kept going, and simply ran out of room to go anywhere except up. The ocean floor between the two land masses, an ancient sea called the Tethys, was consumed, folded, and in places thrust bodily skyward as India's leading edge rammed into the softer, more yielding rock of southern Asia. The crust in the collision zone, unable to slide beneath itself the way oceanic crust usually does at subduction boundary, instead crumpled upward and thickened dramatically, doubling in places from the roughly 35 kilometres, typical of continental crust elsewhere, to something closer to 70 or 80 kilometres, an enormous buried keel of rock, extending down into the mantle beneath what would become the highest mountain range on the planet. Above ground, the visible result of that buried thickening rose slowly, ridge by ridge, over tens of millions of years into the Himalayas. And near the eastern edge of that emerging range, one peak, built from rock that had once been the floor of the Tethys Sea itself, pushed higher than any of its neighbours. Today we call it Mount Everest, or Sagarmatha, or Chomolungma, depending on which side of it you were born, and its summit sits, according to the most recent joint survey conducted by Nepal and China in 2020, at 8,849 metres above sea level, roughly 29,032 feet, tall enough that commercial airliners, cruising at their normal operating altitude, sometimes pass not all that far above its peak, tall enough that the summit pokes into air so thin it holds barely a third of the oxygen your lungs are used to at sea level, air that will begin killing an unacclimatized human body within hours of prolonged exposure in a zone mountaineers have, without much poetry, simply started calling the death zone. That is the mountain that exists. That is the height written into satellite geodesy, into decades of trigonometric survey work, into the marine fossils, remnants of ancient sea creatures that climbers have carried down from ground that was, 50 million years ago, quietly resting at the bottom of an ocean. But tonight, we're going to imagine something else. We're going to ask what would have happened if the same forces that built this mountain, the same relentless collision, the same folding and thickening crust, had simply won a slightly larger share of their ancient argument with erosion. What if Everest, instead of standing at 8,849 metres, stood at nearly double that? Somewhere close to 17,700 metres. A mountain so tall that, as we'll spend the rest of tonight discovering, it would test the very physical limits of what a mountain on this planet can be. It nearly could have gone that way. The final height of any mountain range is not a fixed destination written into its geology from the start. It is the outcome of an ongoing, millions of years long tug of war between the forces pushing rock upward and the forces, mostly rain, rivers and ice, wearing it back down again. Tune that balance even slightly differently. Slow the erosion, or speed the uplift, or extend the collision's most violent phase by a few million additional years, and the peak sitting at the roof of the world today could very plausibly have finished considerably taller than the one we actually got. So before we go further, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you're genuinely enjoying what we do here. And let me know in the comments where in the world you're listening from tonight. I always love seeing how far these stories travel. Now dim the lights if you haven't already. Let your body settle into wherever you're lying. Picture wind moving across a slope of broken rock at an altitude higher than any human being has ever willingly stood, thin and cold and constant, and beneath it, buried in stone that was once the floor of a warm, shallow sea, the slow, patient math of plate tectonics still quietly working itself out, the way it has for 50 million years, the way it still is right now, underneath you, wherever you happen to be lying tonight. This is the story of a mountain that never stopped climbing. Let's walk all the way up it together. Chapter 1. How we know how tall it really is. Before we can meaningfully imagine a taller Everest, we need to understand how confidently we actually know the height of the real one. And that turns out to be a genuinely remarkable story of patient, careful measurement carried out long before anyone had satellites or lasers to help. In the middle of the 19th century, the British-run Great Trigonometric Survey of India set out to map the entire subcontinent using a network of measurement stations, each one triangulated against its neighbours with theodolites precise enough to determine distances and elevations across hundreds of kilometres without ever needing to physically approach the peaks being measured, which was fortunate because at the time Nepal was closed to British surveyors entirely, and the mountain in question sat well inside its borders, visible only from stations built more than 100 miles away on the Indian plains. The peak was catalogued simply as Peak 15, one of dozens of Himalayan summits the survey was working through in sequence, and for years it drew no particular attention. That changed in the early 1850s, when a mathematician named Radhanath Sikdar, working in the survey's Calcutta office, processed the observational data taken from 6 different survey stations and calculated something startling. Peak 15 wasn't simply another tall Himalayan mountain among many. Based on the triangulated readings, it appeared to be the tallest point on the surface of the Earth, taller than any peak previously measured anywhere in the world. The calculation, adjusted for atmospheric refraction and the curvature of the Earth, put its height at right around 29,000 feet, a number so suspiciously round that the survey reportedly published it as 29,002 feet instead, worried that a perfectly even number would look like a rough guess rather than a precise measurement, even though the actual margin of error at the time was almost certainly larger than that 2-foot adjustment implied. The mountain was later named Everest, after Sir George Everest, a former Surveyor General of India who had overseen much of the broader triangulation project, though notably not the specific survey that identified this particular peak, and who, according to most accounts, actually objected to having a Himalayan summit named after him, on the grounds that he'd never seen it and that local names, Sagarmatha in Nepali, Chomolungma in Tibetan, already existed and were perfectly serviceable. His objections didn't carry the day. What's remarkable looking back is how close that 19th century estimate came to holding up. Modern measurements using GPS, satellite radar, and increasingly precise gravimetric surveys have refined the number considerably, most recently in a joint 2020 survey conducted by teams from both Nepal and China using GPS receivers placed directly on the summit alongside traditional ground-penetrating measurements of the snow depth sitting atop the actual rock beneath, arriving at the currently accepted figure of 8,849 metres. That modern figure differs from Sikdar's 19th century calculation, made with nothing but theodolites and trigonometry from stations over 100 miles away by only a matter of metres out of nearly 9,000. There's a second, entirely separate line of evidence that confirms not just the mountain's height but its origin story, and it comes from something climbers have been hauling down off the summit for the better part of a century: rock. The uppermost layers of Everest, geologists have confirmed through direct sampling, are made of limestone containing the fossilised remains of ancient marine creatures, crinoids, trilobites, and other organisms that lived and died on the floor of the Tethys Sea tens of millions of years before that seafloor was ever thrust skyward. Expedition members as far back as the 1920s brought pieces of this rock down with them, and subsequent geological analysis has left very little ambiguity. The highest point on Earth's surface is built in its topmost layers from what used to be the bottom of an ocean. Between the survey data and the rock samples, we have about as solid a foundation as geology offers for anything: a precisely measured height, and a well-understood mechanism for how that height came to exist in the first place. Everything we imagine from here builds on that same foundation, just extended a little further than it actually went. Chapter 2. A peak. Balanced on a tug-of-war here is the idea that makes tonight's entire thought experiment possible, and it's one that surprises a lot of people the first time they really sit with it. The height of a mountain is not a fixed, finished number. It's a running total, updated continuously, of two opposing forces that never actually stop working against each other. On one side of the ledger sits uplift. The Indian and Eurasian plates are still colliding today, still pressing against each other at a rate geologists estimate at somewhere around 4 to 5 centimetres a year, a fraction of India's ancient sprint, but still enough, over millions of years, to keep pushing the Himalayas upward. Studies using GPS monitoring stations anchored into the bedrock around Everest have found the peak is very likely still rising, by a few millimetres most years, an amount too small to notice in a human lifetime but large enough to matter across geological time. On the other side of the ledger sits erosion, and in the Himalayas, erosion is not a gentle, background process. It's ferocious. The same monsoon system that waters the Indian subcontinent each summer slams directly into the southern face of the range, dumping extraordinary quantities of rain onto slopes already steep enough to be unstable, triggering landslides, feeding rivers that cut down through rock at rates that would be considered dramatic almost anywhere else on the planet. Add in the grinding, scouring work of glaciers at higher elevations, freeze-thaw cycles that split rock apart season after season, and you have a mountain range that is being worn down nearly as aggressively as it's being pushed up. The height we actually measure today, 8,849 meters, is essentially the running score line of that ongoing contest, not a finish line either side has crossed. This is genuinely useful to understand because it means the specific height Everest happens to have reached by our particular moment in geological time was never inevitable. Shift that balance, even modestly, sustained over a long enough stretch of millions of years, and you get a meaningfully different number. A somewhat drier regional climate delivering less monsoon rainfall to erode the southern slopes. A slightly longer window before erosion caught up with the most violent, fastest uplifting phase of the collision. A crustal route beneath the peak, unusually resistant to the kind of deep structural weakening that eventually slows uplift elsewhere along the range. Any of these, individually or in combination, nudges the final number upward. But we should be honest about something else too, something that makes tonight's specific premise genuinely stretch the edges of plausibility in a way that's worth naming directly rather than glossing over. There does appear to be a real, physical ceiling on how tall a mountain can get on a planet like ours, and it isn't set by erosion at all, it's set by the rock itself. As a mountain grows taller, the weight of everything above pressing down on the rock at its base increases correspondingly, and rock, however solid it feels underfoot, has a compressive strength limit. Push past that limit, and instead of remaining rigid, the rock at the base begins to behave less like a solid, and more like a very, very slow-moving fluid, deforming and spreading sideways under its own weight, rather than continuing to support additional height above it. Geologists studying this effect on Earth have generally put the theoretical ceiling somewhere in the neighbourhood of 10 kilometres, give or take, depending on the specific rock types and structural geometry involved. A number Everest, at just under 9 kilometres, is already brushing up against. Compare that to Olympus Mons on Mars, the tallest known mountain in the entire solar system, standing at roughly 21 to 25 kilometres, depending on precisely where you measure from, nearly 3 times Everest's height. Olympus Mons gets away with a height that would be structurally impossible on Earth for 2 specific reasons. Mars's gravity is only about 38% as strong as Earth's, which means a given height of rock presses down on its own base, with dramatically less force there than the same height would here. And Mars has no plate tectonics, no moving crustal plates carrying a volcano away from the hotspot that feeds it the way Earth's plates carry the Hawaiian Islands slowly away from their volcanic source. Olympus Mons simply sat in the same spot, over the same plume of rising magma for hundreds of millions of years, building higher and higher with nothing to physically stop it, and nothing to carry it away from its own fuel supply. Earth offers no such loophole. Given our gravity and our rock strength, a mountain reaching nearly 18,000 meters, twice Everest's actual height, sits right at the outer edge of what most geologists would consider geologically defensible, and arguably somewhat past it. So let's be honest about what we're actually imagining tonight. Not simply a slower, eroding, faster rising version of the real Himalayan story, but one that also requires unusually strong, unusually rigid bedrock at the mountain's foundation, rock able to bear a genuinely exceptional load without beginning that slow structural creep. It's speculative in a way that pushes right up against the edge of known physics, and we're going to hold that tension honestly rather than pretend it away, because what makes this thought experiment interesting isn't that it's easy to justify. It's that it sits exactly on the line between astonishing and impossible, and tonight we're choosing to imagine the world on the other side of that line. Chapter 3. The mountain they would have inherited. To picture what a taller Everest would have meant for everything downstream, quite literally, we first need to understand the mountain and its surrounding world as they actually exist at the moment just before our imagined divergence takes hold. The Everest region, in our real history, sits near the eastern portion of the Himalayan arc, part of a broader knot of extremely high peaks that includes Lhotse, Nuptse and Cho Oyu, all clustered close enough together that from a distance they read almost as a single jagged wall, rather than individual mountains. The immediate approach on the Nepali side runs through the Khumbu region, home to the Sherpa people, whose ancestors migrated into these valleys from eastern Tibet several hundred years ago, and who have, ever since, built a culture intricately adapted to high-altitude life, settlements at elevations that would leave most lowlanders gasping, agricultural and trading practices calibrated to short growing seasons and thin air. And, since the era of Western mountaineering began in earnest in the 20th century, an entire economy and body of specialized expertise built around guiding, portering and route fixing on the mountain itself. The physical mountain is dominated in its lower and middle reaches by the Khumbu icefall, a chaotic, constantly shifting field of house-sized ice blocks and crevasses formed where the Khumbu Glacier tumbles down a particularly steep section of the route, widely regarded as one of the most objectively dangerous stretches on the entire standard climbing route, precisely because the ice is always moving, opening new crevasses and collapsing old ice towers with no real warning. Above it lies the western, a relatively gentle glacial valley climbers have nicknamed the Valley of Silence for its usually still, windless air, followed by the imposing Lhotse face, a wall of glacial ice angled steeply enough that falls here are a leading cause of climbing accidents, and finally the South Col, a wind-scoured saddle at just under 8,000 metres that serves as the last camp before the final summit push, sitting essentially inside the boundary of what climbers call the death zone. The mountain sits too within a broader web of Buddhist and Hindu spiritual significance that long predates any Western mountaineering interest in the peak. Its Tibetan name Chomolungma generally translated as something close to Goddess Mother of the World, and its lower slopes and approach valleys dotted with monasteries, prayer flags, and centuries of pilgrimage tradition that treat the entire massif as sacred ground regardless of whether any particular visitor intends to climb it at all. This context matters for what follows, because whatever this mountain became in our alternate timeline, it wouldn't have been arriving into a cultural vacuum. It would have been arriving into the same deep well of regional meaning and reverence the real Everest already occupies, simply attached to a considerably larger, considerably more physically extreme mountain than the one that meaning actually grew up around. Above the South Col, oxygen becomes the defining fact of existence. At that altitude, atmospheric pressure has dropped to roughly a third of what it is at sea level, which means each breath delivers roughly a third of the oxygen a person's body is used to processing. Most climbers attempting the summit from this point use supplemental bottled oxygen, though a small, well-documented number of elite mountaineers have summited without it. At extraordinary physiological cost, their bodies operating in a state doctors describe as being in active, ongoing decline. The entire time they remain at that elevation, cells starved of the oxygen they need, judgment and coordination measurably degrading by the hour. The weather at these elevations is dominated by forces most climbers rarely see in any other context. The jet stream, a narrow ribbon of extremely fast-moving air that circles the globe at altitudes generally between roughly 9 and 16 kilometers, sits close enough to Everest's actual summit that in winter months, hurricane-force winds regularly scour the peak directly, winds strong enough to make survival there essentially impossible for any length of time. The narrow windows when the jet stream temporarily shifts north, typically for a handful of days in May and again briefly in autumn, are what create the famous, crowded summit windows that dominate contemporary Everest expedition planning. Hundreds of climbers converging on the same few calm days, because the mountain is for the rest of the year simply too violent to survive on. This is the mountain and the world around it, exactly as it exists today, already extreme, already testing the outer limits of human physiology and endurance, already balanced on a razor's edge between the jet stream above and the glacier-fed valleys below. Everything we're about to imagine takes this world as its honest starting point and asks what happens when the single number defining the mountain's height simply keeps climbing, past every threshold this real Everest already sits so close to. Chapter 4. The myth that mountains can grow forever. Before we climb any further into speculation, it's worth clearing up something that popular imagination tends to get wrong about mountains, because understanding the actual limits involved is what makes an alternate 17,700 metre Everest feel less like arbitrary fantasy and more like a specific bounded thought experiment. The common intuition goes something like this. Mountains are built by tectonic forces, and tectonic forces are, on human timescales, essentially unlimited, grinding away for millions of years without any obvious reason to stop. So given enough time, shouldn't a mountain range just keep climbing indefinitely, limited only by how long the collision driving it continues? It's an intuitive story, and it's almost entirely wrong, for reasons that have less to do with tectonics and more to do with something much more mundane, the physical strength of rock itself. We touched on this a chapter ago, but it's worth sitting with directly because it's the central physical constraint shaping everything we imagine from here forward. Rock, like any solid material, has a compressive strength, a maximum amount of pressure it can bear before it stops behaving like a rigid solid and starts behaving like an extremely slow-moving fluid, flowing sideways under sustained load the way a thick glacier flows downhill, just far more slowly. The taller a mountain gets, the more weight its base has to support, and eventually for essentially any known rock type under Earth's gravity, that weight exceeds what the base can bear while remaining structurally rigid. Past that point, additional uplift doesn't translate into additional height. It translates into the mountain's base spreading outward, its whole structure slumping and widening rather than climbing higher, in the same general way that a scoop of very stiff dough, pressed down on hard enough, spreads outward at the bottom, rather than simply getting taller. Geologists studying this effect across different mountain ranges and rock compositions have generally converged on an estimate somewhere in the neighbourhood of 10 kilometres as the practical ceiling for a mountain built on Earth, under Earth's gravity, out of the kinds of rock actually available in Earth's crust. It's not a hard, precise line, more a zone where structural failure becomes increasingly likely the further past it you push, but it's a real, physically grounded constraint, not an arbitrary round number, and it's the reason Olympus Mons, at more than double that height, could never exist here, no matter how long a hypothetical Earth volcano sat over a hypothetical hotspot. Mars gets away with its impossible height because Martian gravity is dramatically weaker, reducing the load any given height of rock imposes on its own base, and because Mars lacks the plate tectonics that, on Earth, would eventually carry any volcano away from the very hotspot feeding it, capping how long it has to keep building in one place. This matters enormously for how we should think about tonight's premise. We are not simply imagining a somewhat taller, somewhat more dramatic version of the same Everest that already exists. We're imagining a mountain sitting close to, or arguably beyond, the outer edge of what's considered structurally sustainable for any mountain on this planet. That's worth being honest about rather than glossing over, because it changes what we're actually exploring tonight. This isn't a documentary about a slightly different climate history producing a slightly taller peak. It's a documentary about what it would take, and what it would mean, for Earth to host something close to its own absolute structural limit. A mountain not just taller than any that exists, but arguably taller than geology, as we currently understand it, thinks any mountain on this planet is really supposed to be able to get. Chapter 5. The First Million Years of a Taller Himalaya. Let's set the divergence point somewhere in the deep past, not as a single dramatic moment, but as a gradual shift beginning perhaps 20 million years ago, during the period when the Himalayan collision was already at its most intense. A modestly drier regional climate than the one that actually developed, delivering somewhat less monsoon rainfall to the range's southern face, paired with bedrock at the collision's easternmost peaks, unusually resistant to the deep structural weakening that, in our actual history, eventually slows uplift as mountain ranges mature. Neither change is wildly implausible on its own. Together, sustained across tens of millions of years, they tip the balance of uplift versus erosion further toward uplift than it actually tipped, and the mountain that would become Everest simply keeps climbing longer and higher before the two forces settle into their eventual near standoff. Picture the range during this extended building phase, a few million years into the divergence. The peaks are already taller than anything in our actual Himalayas, their upper slopes permanently locked in ice and snow at elevations where, in our real history, only the very highest handful of summits reach at all. The glaciers feeding off these growing peaks are correspondingly larger, thicker rivers of ice grinding slowly down valleys that, in our timeline, host glaciers of a more modest scale. Because a drier regional climate means less monsoon-driven erosion, the valleys themselves would likely be somewhat less dramatically carved than the steep landslide-prone gorges of the real Himalayas, the mountains rising from a landscape shaped more by ice and wind than by the ferocious seasonal deluge that so aggressively sculpt the actual range. The ecological consequences ripple outward quickly, even at this early stage. A taller, more extensive high-altitude zone means a larger area locked permanently above the tree line, less habitable terrain for the alpine plants and animals that, in our actual Himalayas, cling to narrow bands of tolerable elevation on the mountain's lower and middle slopes. species that in our real history occupy the highest reaches of the range, snow leopards hunting blue sheep across rocky alpine terrain, Himalayan tahr grazing precarious slopes, would likely have found their available habitat compressed into a narrower vertical band, squeezed between an expanding ice-locked summit zone above and whatever ecosystems persisted in the valleys below. The atmospheric effects, though, are where this early divergence starts to matter well beyond the mountains themselves. A taller Himalayan wall, even at this intermediate stage of its extended growth, would be intercepting monsoon moisture more forcefully than the real range does, wringing more rain and snow out of air masses forced to climb over an increasingly formidable barrier. This is speculation grounded in a real, well-understood atmospheric mechanism, orographic lift, the same process that makes the windward slopes of any sufficiently tall mountain range dramatically wetter than the leeward side, and it would only intensify as the peaks kept climbing. The southern flank of this growing range would likely have become wetter over time, even as the drier regional baseline we've assumed helped drive the mountain's extra height in the first place. A genuinely complex feedback loop that real climate scientists studying the actual Himalayas have spent decades trying to fully untangle, and one we can only sketch here in broad strokes rather than precise detail. What we can say with more confidence is the general shape of what this million-year window produces, a range not simply scaled up uniformly from the real Himalayas, but reorganized around a more extreme vertical gradient, taller peaks, larger glaciers, a sharper divide between wet windward slopes and dry leeward plateau, setting the stage for everything that follows as this extended building phase eventually approaches its own limits. The same structural limits we discussed a couple of chapters back, now looming much closer for this particular peak than they ever did for the real Everest. Chapter 6, Into the Death Zone That Never Ends. Let's talk about what altitude actually does to a human body, because it's the single factor that would most completely reshape our alternate Everest's relationship with the people trying to reach its summit. Atmospheric pressure decreases with the altitude in a fairly predictable way, and along with it, so does the partial pressure of oxygen, the actual amount of oxygen available in each breath your lungs take in. At sea level, that pressure sits at a baseline your body evolved to run on comfortably. By the time you reach the real Everest summit at 8,849 meters, atmospheric pressure has dropped to roughly a third of sea level, and above about 8,000 meters, the human body enters a state doctors and climbers alike simply call the death zone, an altitude where no amount of acclimatization allows a person to survive indefinitely, where cells are being starved of oxygen faster than the body can compensate, where judgment, coordination, and basic physiological function measurably deteriorate hour by hour, and where, without supplemental oxygen, most people begin actively dying, slowly, the moment they arrive. Real Everest climbers describe the death zone in strikingly consistent terms across decades of published accounts. A fog settling over memory and decision-making, simple tasks like clipping a carabiner taking minutes instead of seconds, a creeping indifference to danger that has, in documented cases, led experienced climbers to step past injured companions without registering what they were seeing. Doctors studying these accounts generally attribute the pattern to a combination of hypoxia's direct effects on brain tissue and the body's broader physiological triage, shutting down anything not immediately necessary for continued movement in order to preserve function in only the most essential systems. Our alternate Everest, at nearly 18,000 meters, would be climbing through an atmosphere that has thinned dramatically further still. This is worth translating into something concrete. Commercial airliners typically cruise at altitudes of around 10 to 12 kilometers, and the air outside the cabin at that altitude is so thin that unprotected human beings would lose useful consciousness within seconds without a pressurized cabin or supplemental oxygen. Our imagined summit at nearly 18 kilometers sits well above typical cruising altitude for a commercial jet, in atmospheric territory that begins to shade into what's sometimes called the Armstrong line, the altitude, usually sighted around 19 kilometers, above which atmospheric pressure drops so low that water boils at normal human body temperature, meaning exposed bodily fluids would begin to vaporize without a pressurized suit. Our summit doesn't quite cross that specific threshold, but it sits close enough to it that we're no longer meaningfully talking about mountaineering physiology in the way climbers understand it on the real Everest. We're talking about something closer to the edge of aviation and spaceflight medicine. What this means, practically, is that the entire framework of acclimatization, the weeks-long process by which real Everest climbers gradually adjust their bodies to reduced oxygen by ascending in stages, resting at intermediate camps, allowing their blood chemistry to shift in ways that improve oxygen uptake, would almost certainly fail to bridge the gap on our alternate peak. Acclimatization helps enormously up to a point, which is exactly why some elite climbers can summit the real Everest without bottled oxygen at all, at extraordinary physiological cost. But acclimatization has limits, and those limits appear to sit somewhere not too far above the real Everest's actual summit altitude, in a zone doctors sometimes describe a little grimly as roughly the ceiling of what human biology can sustain even briefly, regardless of preparation. Our alternate summit sits well beyond that ceiling. This is speculation about a mountain that, by definition, has never existed for anyone to actually test, but it's grounded in genuinely well-studied human physiology rather than guesswork. The most plausible conclusion is a stark one. Unprotected human ascent to the summit of this taller Everest likely wouldn't be possible at all, not even briefly, not even for the most extraordinary oxygen-adapted elite climbers our species has ever produced. Reaching the true summit would almost certainly require something closer to a pressurized suit, the kind of equipment used for high-altitude research flights or early spacewalks, rather than the down suits and oxygen bottles that get climbers up the real mountain today. There's something worth sitting with in that conclusion. The real Everest, as extreme as it is, still sits within reach of human beings pushing themselves to their absolute physiological edge, using nothing more exotic than bottled oxygen, careful acclimatization, and extraordinary willpower. Our alternate Everest would sit past that edge entirely, a summit visible, climbable partway, but genuinely, permanently out of reach of the human body as it actually works, without technology that starts to resemble spaceflight more than mountaineering. We'll come back to what that would have meant for the history and culture of climbing in a few chapters. For now, just hold the image. A peak so tall that reaching its true summit isn't simply extraordinarily difficult, it's very nearly a different category of undertaking altogether. Chapter 7. The Wind That Never Stops. If oxygen is the mountain's first great barrier, wind is very plausibly its second, and it's worth understanding exactly why, because the mechanism is more specific and more strange than most people realize. The jet stream is a narrow, fast-moving river of air circling the globe at high altitude, driven by the temperature contrast between polar and tropical air masses, and it typically sits somewhere between roughly 9 and 16 kilometers above sea level, depending on season and latitude. Wind speeds inside it regularly exceed 150 kilometers an hour, sometimes considerably more, hurricane-force winds that, unlike an actual, Hurricane never really stop, simply meander north and south with the seasons in a broad, semi-predictable pattern. The real Everest, at just under 9 kilometres, sits close enough to the jet stream's usual lower boundary that in winter months the stream frequently sags directly onto the summit, scouring it with sustained hurricane-force winds that make survival there, for any length of time, essentially impossible. The famous narrow summit windows that Everest expeditions plan around, typically a handful of days in May and a shorter window in autumn, exist specifically because the jet stream temporarily migrates northward during those periods, briefly leaving the summit in calmer air. Our alternate Everest, at nearly double the real mountain's height, would be pushing well up into the jet stream's typical operating altitude for a much larger fraction of the year, rather than merely brushing its lower edge during winter months. This is grounded in a straightforward extension of well-understood atmospheric science. A peak sitting consistently inside the jet stream's usual band would face sustained hurricane-force winds not just during a predictable winter season, but across a much wider stretch of the calendar, with the brief, reliable windows that make real Everest summit attempts plannable potentially shrinking dramatically, or in the most extreme readings of this scenario, vanishing into unpredictability almost entirely. It's worth pairing this with something we touched on a couple of chapters ago: the temperature at this altitude. Air temperature drops steadily with elevation, and by the time you reach the real Everest summit, average temperatures sit reliably below negative 20 degrees Celsius, even in relatively mild conditions. Colder still when wind chill from summit gusts is factored in, sometimes plunging past negative 60. Push another 9 kilometres higher into thinner, generally colder air, and you're looking at a summit environment where sustained temperatures well below negative 50 degrees Celsius would likely be the norm rather than an occasional extreme, combined with wind conditions that, for large stretches of the year, would make the real Everest's already legendary winter storms look comparatively mild. Put the oxygen problem from the last chapter together with this one, and the practical picture becomes fairly stark. A summit that's not simply higher than any human has ever stood, but one sitting for much of the year inside a band of essentially permanent hurricane-force wind, in temperatures cold enough to cause frostbite on exposed skin within minutes, breathing air too thin to sustain consciousness without specialized equipment. This isn't a mountain that's simply harder to climb than the real Everest. It's a mountain whose upper reaches would very plausibly sit outside the reasonable operating envelope of mountaineering as a human activity altogether, for all but the narrowest, most technologically assisted expeditions willing to treat the final ascent less like a climb and more like a brief, heavily engineered incursion into conditions the human body was never built to tolerate. Chapter 8: Rivers Born from Ice. Let's turn now to something that reaches far beyond the mountain itself, because the real Himalayas already function as one of the most important water towers on the planet, and a range built around a peak nearly twice Everest's actual height would very plausibly amplify that role dramatically. In our real world, Himalayan glaciers and snowpack feed some of the most significant river systems in Asia: the Ganges, the Brahmaputra, and, further west along the broader range, the Indus, rivers that together support drinking water, irrigation, and hydroelectric power for an enormous fraction of the human population living across South Asia. These rivers don't simply carry rainfall runoff, a substantial portion of their flow, particularly during the dry season when monsoon rains aren't actively replenishing the system, comes from glacial meltwater, ice that accumulated at high altitude over winters past, slowly releasing itself downstream through the warmer months, functioning as a kind of natural reservoir that smooths out what would otherwise be a much more feast or famine water supply. A taller Himalayan range, building and sustaining significantly larger glacier systems at its highest elevations, the way we discussed a few chapters back would very plausibly be storing considerably more frozen water at any given time than the real range does, and releasing it downstream in correspondingly larger volumes. This is speculation grounded in a fairly direct physical relationship. More ice mass at altitude generally means a larger meltwater reservoir feeding the rivers below, all else being equal. The Ganges, Brahmaputra and Indus of this alternate timeline might plausibly run larger, more reliable and less vulnerable to the kind of dry season water stress that already concerns hydrologists studying the real river system's futures, as the actual smaller Himalayan glaciers respond to a warming climate. There's a flip side worth naming honestly though, because larger glacier systems don't only mean more reliable water. They also mean a river system more dependent on that ice remaining stable, and more vulnerable to the specific kind of catastrophic event known as a glacial lake outburst flood, where meltwater pooling behind a natural ice or debris dam suddenly breaches, releasing an enormous volume of water downstream in a matter of hours, rather than the gradual seasonal trickle the system is built to handle. These events already occur periodically in the real Himalayas, and a range hosting substantially larger glacier systems would plausibly be capable of producing correspondingly larger, more destructive versions of the same phenomenon, a genuinely double-edged consequence of the same underlying cause that makes the alternate river systems more reliable in ordinary years. The agricultural and demographic implications downstream are significant enough that they deserve to be stated plainly, even while acknowledging how speculative any specific claim about them has to be. The Gangetic Plain in our actual history became one of the most densely populated and agriculturally productive regions on the planet, substantially because of the reliable water the Himalayan river system provides, supporting rice and wheat cultivation across a floodplain that has sustained human civilization continuously for thousands of years. A more reliable, higher volume version of that same water supply might plausibly have supported an even larger agricultural base, an even denser population across the same general region, though we genuinely cannot say with confidence exactly how much larger, or exactly how the balance of benefit against increased flood risk would ultimately have played out across the many centuries of human settlement this river system has actually supported. What we can say with more confidence is the general shape of the relationship. A taller Himalaya isn't simply a taller pile of rock sitting in isolation. It's the header tank for an entire river system that, in our actual history, quite literally makes life possible for hundreds of millions of people living hundreds or even thousands of kilometers from the mountains themselves. Change the height of the range dramatically, and you're very plausibly changing the terms under which an enormous fraction of South Asia's human history actually unfolded, not through any direct mechanism involving the mountain's height alone, but through the water it stores, releases, and occasionally, catastrophically, lets go all at once. Chapter 9. The Wall That Remade a Monsoon. There's one more atmospheric consequence worth walking through carefully because it may be the single most far-reaching climatic effect of everything we've imagined tonight, and it concerns a weather system that shapes life for well over 1 billion people every single year: the South Asian monsoon. In our actual world, the Himalayas already function as a formidable barrier, forcing warmer, moisture-laden air moving north off the Indian Ocean to rise sharply as it encounters the range, cooling as it climbs and wringing out enormous quantities of rain in the process, a mechanism meteorologists call orographic lift. This is why certain windward-facing Himalayan foothill regions, places like Cherrapunji and nearby Mawsynram in northeastern India, rank among the wettest places on the entire planet, recording annual rainfall totals that can exceed 10 metres in a single year, an almost incomprehensible volume of water dumped onto a relatively small stretch of mountainside. On the far side of the range, the story reverses completely. By the time air masses have climbed over the peaks and begun descending on the northern leeward side, they've been wrung largely dry, contributing to the Tibetan Plateau's status as one of the driest, most desolate high-altitude environments on the planet, a genuine rain shadow effect operating at a truly continental scale. A taller barrier intensifies both halves of this equation. This is speculation grounded in the same well-understood orographic mechanism already shaping the real monsoon, simply extended further, air forced to climb over peaks approaching 18 kilometres, rather than the real range's already formidable but comparatively lower profile, would be pushed through an even more dramatic pressure and temperature change on the way up, very plausibly wringing out even greater quantities of rainfall on the windward southern slopes before it ever crests the range. The already extraordinary rainfall totals recorded at places like Cherrapunji might, in this alternate history, be dwarfed by conditions somewhere along our taller range's southern face, a genuinely difficult figure to estimate with any confidence, but almost certainly trending toward even more extreme rather than less. Meteorologists studying the real monsoon's mechanics have long noted that the system isn't simply a matter of moisture arriving and rain falling in proportion. The Himalayas also function as an elevated heat source in their own right, their sun-warmed slopes helping drive the pressure differences that pull moist air north off the Indian Ocean in the first place. A feedback loop where the mountains don't just block and lift moisture, but actively help generate the atmospheric pull that draws the monsoon toward them each year. A taller range, presenting a larger elevated heating surface, might plausibly strengthen this pulling effect too, drawing the monsoon in with even greater force, compounding the more familiar orographic lift mechanism we've already discussed. The northern leeward side would very plausibly see the opposite intensification, an even more thoroughly desiccated Tibetan plateau, air arriving from over the mountains having been wrung even more comprehensively dry than it already is in our actual history, potentially extending the plateau's already stark aridity across a wider area, or deepening it in ways that would have shaped everything from vegetation patterns to the specific paths early human and animal populations found viable for crossing or settling this already challenging high-altitude environment. It's worth pausing on just how much rides on this single mechanism, because monsoon rainfall isn't simply a matter of regional weather trivia. The South Asian monsoon, in our actual history, determines agricultural yields across an enormous swathe of the Indian subcontinent, arriving reliably enough in most years to support the rice and wheat cultivation that has fed South Asian civilizations for millennia, but variable enough from year to year that a poor monsoon season has historically meant genuine famine risk for populations dependent on it. A monsoon reorganised around an even more dramatic mountain barrier, delivering rainfall in even more extreme, more concentrated patterns, might plausibly have meant a wetter, more agriculturally generous southern zone paired with an even harsher, more marginal northern plateau, reshaping where dense human settlement was viable across the entire region in ways that would have rippled outward into the whole subsequent course of South Asian history, agriculture, and settlement patterns. We genuinely cannot trace out the specific civilizations, migrations, or historical events that might have unfolded differently under this reorganized climate system, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. What we can say, grounded in real, well-studied atmospheric mechanics, is that the basic shape of the change is plausible and significant. A taller Himalaya doesn't just alter a mountain range. It very likely alters the climate of an entire subcontinent, wetter here, drier there, in ways that would have quietly, persistently shaped human history across a region home, in our actual timeline, to well over 1 billion people. Chapter 10. A roof nobody has touched. Let's turn now to the human story, because the real Everest carries an entire century of mountaineering history wrapped around it, and our alternate peak would carry something very different. In our actual timeline, the mountain drew serious Western attention starting in the 1920s, when British expeditions began probing routes from the Tibetan side, Nepal still being closed to foreign travellers at the time. George Mallory, on one of these early expeditions, was famously asked why he wanted to climb Everest, and offered a brief, 3-word answer that has outlived nearly everything else recorded about those attempts. Mallory died on the mountain in 1924, along with his climbing partner Andrew Irvine, in circumstances that remained genuinely uncertain whether either man reached the true summit before perishing on the descent for the better part of a century afterward. The first confirmed successful ascent came nearly 3 decades later, in 1953, when Edmund Hillary, a New Zealand beekeeper, and Tenzing Norgay, a Sherpa climber whose family had lived in the mountain's shadow for generations, reached the summit together as part of a British expedition, an achievement that made global headlines and, almost overnight, transformed Everest from a remote, largely theoretical challenge into the single most recognisable mountaineering objective on the planet. Everything that followed, the gradual opening of commercial guided expeditions starting in the 1980s and 1990s, the rise of a genuine, if still extraordinarily risky, tourism industry around the mountain, the elite subculture of climbers pursuing summits without supplemental oxygen, the Sherpa guiding economy that grew up around all of it, rests on one basic underlying fact. However difficult and dangerous the real Everest is, it remains, for a well-prepared, well-acclimatized climber with bottled oxygen, achievable. Difficult, yes. Sometimes fatal, certainly. But achievable, which is precisely why more than 6,000 successful summits have been recorded across the decades since Hillary and Norgay's first ascent. Our alternate Everest, sitting well beyond the physiological and atmospheric limits we spent the last several chapters walking through, would almost certainly never have accumulated anything resembling that history. This is speculation, clearly, since we're imagining a mountain that never actually existed for anyone to attempt, but it's grounded directly in the physiological and atmospheric constraints we've already established, rather than invented from nothing. Early expeditions, in whatever form they took in this timeline, would likely have reached a certain altitude, probably somewhere in the general vicinity of where the real Everest summit actually sits, and then found themselves facing a wall not of rock or ice, but of biology and physics. Air too thin, wind too violent, cold too extreme for unaided human ascent to continue meaningfully further, no matter how skilled or determined the climbers involved. It's worth imagining what this would have done to the mountain's cultural weight rather than diminished it. A peak that remained across the entire 20th century and into whatever counts as the present day in this timeline, visibly, unmistakably present on the horizon. The tallest thing any nearby population had ever seen, and yet genuinely untouched, unclimbed. Its true summit never once bearing a human footprint, might well have accumulated a different, arguably deeper kind of mythology than the real Everest's actual climbing history produced. Not a mountain conquered and photographed, and, in some critics' eyes, somewhat commercialized by decades of guided expeditions, but a mountain that simply remained, permanently, the one place genuinely beyond reach, its upper reaches visible from enormous distances on clear days, wrapped in whatever cloud and wind-blown snow the jet stream was throwing at it that particular afternoon, watched but never actually touched. The Sherpa communities living in its shadow would presumably still have developed the same intimate, generations-deep relationship with the mountain's lower and middle slopes that they've developed with the real Everest, herding, trading, eventually guiding, across terrain that remained genuinely accessible, even if the true summit never did. What likely wouldn't exist is the specific economy built around guiding paying clients to the actual top, the fixed ropes strung across the Khumbu icefall each season, the guiding companies, the crowded photographs of queued climbers waiting their turn near the summit ridge that periodically make international news in our real timeline. Whatever economy and culture did develop around this alternate peak would have organized itself, necessarily, around getting as close as biology allowed, rather than around the summit itself, a fundamentally different relationship between a mountain and the people who lived nearest to it. Chapter 11. The World Today. Let's bring this all the way forward now, to whatever counts as the present moment in this alternate timeline, and take stock of what the wider region would actually look like. Stand somewhere on the Gangetic Plain, on a clear day, in this other world, and the mountain would very plausibly be visible from a genuinely startling distance. Height translates directly into visibility across the curvature of the Earth, and a peak approaching 18 kilometers would poke above the horizon from considerably further away than the real Everest, which is itself already visible from parts of the Indian plains on exceptionally clear days, over 100 kilometers distant. Our alternate peak, taller by a factor of 2, would very plausibly remain visible, weather permitting, from considerably greater distances still, a permanent fixture on the northern horizon across a much wider stretch of the subcontinent than the real Himalayas manage, its upper reaches wrapped in a near-constant plume of wind-blown snow torn off the summit by the jet stream, recognizable from cities that, in our actual history, have no direct line of sight to the range at all. Kathmandu itself, sitting in its valley south of the main range, would likely remain the same general kind of gateway city it actually is, though the tourism and mountaineering economy built up around it would look substantially different from what we described a chapter ago. Less about summit permits and guided expeditions to the true top, more oriented around trekking to the highest points actually reachable, viewing platforms and observation treks calibrated to whatever altitude the human body could meaningfully tolerate without the kind of extreme technological intervention we discussed a few chapters back. This is speculative, but it follows fairly directly from everything we've already established. Tourism organises itself around what's achievable, and in this timeline, achievable would mean something considerably more modest, relative to the mountain's actual full height, than it does for the real Everest. Geopolitically, it's worth considering what a peak of this scale, sitting near the already sensitive border zone between Nepal, Tibet, and by extension, China and India's broader regional interests, might have meant for the strategic and symbolic weight of the region. Extremely tall, difficult terrain has historically shaped border disputes and territorial claims in ways that are genuinely hard to predict in specific detail, and we should resist the temptation to invent a confident alternate political history here. What we can say with more grounding is that a mountain of this scale, permanently visible across a wider stretch of the surrounding region, and carrying whatever mythological and national significance a genuinely unclimbed roof of the world would accumulate over centuries, would almost certainly have become an even more potent symbol, in whatever national and cultural narratives grew up around it, than the real Everest already is. Itself no small thing given how thoroughly Everest already functions as a symbol of national pride for both Nepal and China today. The broader Himalayan ecosystem, shaped across this alternate timeline by the wetter southern slopes and drier northern plateau we discussed a couple of chapters back, would likely present a landscape simultaneously, more lush in places and more stark in others, than the real range's already considerable diversity, an intensified version of the ecological gradient that already runs from subtropical forest at lower elevations to high-altitude desert on the Tibetan side, simply stretched further in both directions by a taller, more atmospherically consequential range sitting at its centre. And above it all, visible from the plains, wrapped in permanent wind-blown snow, sitting in air too thin and too violent for the human body to survive unaided, the true summit itself, a fixed point on the horizon that, in this entire alternate history, no living person has ever actually stood upon. Chapter 12. Where the Other Giants Went. Let's turn now to a question this documentary's format keeps returning to in one form or another. Whatever didn't get to dominate in this timeline, where did it end up instead? And here, the answer is unusually direct because it concerns something very specific. The other mountains. In our real world, Everest, at 8,849 metres, is the tallest mountain on Earth. But it isn't alone at the top of the rankings in any dramatic sense. K2, the second highest peak, stands at 8,611 metres, close enough to Everest's height that the gap between the world's first and second tallest mountains is smaller, proportionally, than the gap between many other consecutive rankings in the list. Below that sit 12 more peaks exceeding 8,000 metres. The so-called 8,000ers, a genuinely elite but not singular category, scattered across the Himalayas and the neighbouring Karakoram range, each one a formidable objective in its own right, each one the focus of its own dedicated climbing history, its own body of legendary ascents and tragic failures. Reinhold Messner's famous achievement of summiting all 14 8,000ers, the first person to do so, and doing several without supplemental oxygen, stands as one of mountaineering's most celebrated feats, precisely because it required conquering 14 distinct, individually formidable giants, not simply one mountain that happened to sit slightly above the rest. In our alternate timeline, that entire category essentially collapses into irrelevance, at least as a meaningful ranking. An Everest standing at nearly 18,000 metres would not be the tallest peak among a cluster of comparably enormous mountains. It would be operating in a category entirely alone, roughly double the height of every other 8,000er, a singularity dwarfing not just K2, but the entire rest of the world's tallest mountain list combined in terms of sheer vertical dominance. The 8,000ers, as a meaningful climbing category, the 14 peaks that define one of mountaineering's most prestigious achievements, would likely never have organised themselves around that particular threshold at all, since the actual defining singular challenge of the range would sit so far above and apart from all of them that grouping Everest alongside K2 or Kangchenjunga in the same conversation would feel almost like a category error. This is worth sitting with, because it represents a genuine, poignant loss, not of anything physical, but of an entire structure of human achievement and meaning that grew up in our real history around the specific fact that several mountains happen to cluster near the very top of the height rankings, close enough together that climbing all of them became a coherent, pursuable life's work for a small number of extraordinary athletes. Messner's 14 summit achievement and the dozens of climbers who've pursued similar goals since exists because the real Everest, extraordinary as it is, shares its general altitude class with more than a dozen genuine rivals. Take that clustering away, replace it with one mountain standing in almost complete isolation at the top of the scale, and you lose the specific, human, achievable version of conquering the world's highest peaks that real mountaineering history actually produced. What would K2 have become in this timeline if it remained at its actual height while Everest towered nearly twice as high above it? Almost certainly it would still have retained its real-world reputation for extreme technical difficulty and danger. K2's actual challenge lies less in raw altitude and more in its brutally steep exposed climbing routes, a reputation that has nothing to do with Everest's height and would presumably have persisted unchanged. But its symbolic position as the closest rival to the world's tallest peak, the mountain climbers reach for once Everest feels almost too accessible by comparison, would likely have shifted considerably. Rather than sitting a close second to a summit many well-prepared climbers can realistically hope to reach, it would have become, in effect, the tallest mountain actually climbable by human beings unaided by exotic pressurized equipment, arguably inheriting much of the practical, achievable prestige that Everest itself currently holds in our real world, while the true tallest point on the planet remained something closer to a fixed, unreachable landmark than an athletic objective at all. Chapter 13. The Sky Turns Black at Noon. There's a sensory dimension to all this worth pausing on before we move any further, because altitude doesn't just thin the air and drop the temperature. Past a certain point it starts to change the sky itself, and our alternate summit would sit close enough to that threshold to make the experience, for whatever brief, technologically assisted moment a human being might actually spend there, genuinely strange in ways that have nothing to do with cold or wind at all. At sea level, the sky appears blue because sunlight scatters off the abundant molecules in the thick lower atmosphere, shorter blue wavelengths scattering more readily than longer red ones, which is the entire reason the sky has the colour it does, rather than simply looking like empty space. As you climb higher, the air thins. There are fewer molecules available to do that scattering, and the sky gradually darkens, the blue growing deeper and more saturated, edging toward violet, even as the sun itself remains high overhead. Pilots flying at high altitude, and the small number of stratospheric balloonists and high-altitude parachutists who have documented their experiences at the edge of the atmosphere have consistently described this same phenomenon. A sky that grows steadily darker with height until, somewhere in the upper stratosphere, it shades into something close to black, even in the middle of the day. Faint stars sometimes visible against it despite the sun blazing nearby. A direct visual reminder that blue sky is a product of atmosphere, not an inherent property of daytime itself. The real Everest summit, at just under 9 kilometers, sits within the range where this darkening is already noticeable to climbers, many of whom describe the sky at the top as a deep, almost unnervingly saturated blue, compared to what they're used to seeing from ground level. Our alternate summit, at nearly double that height, would sit considerably further along this same gradient, close enough to the edge of the stratosphere that the sky overhead would very plausibly have shifted towards something climbers would likely describe as closer to violet black than blue, even under full daylight, the curvature of the Earth itself becoming faintly, unmistakably visible along the horizon, a detail normally reserved for high-altitude aircraft, weather balloons, and orbital spacecraft rather than anything reachable by climbing. This is speculation extrapolated from a well-documented physical gradient rather than invented from nothing, and it's worth imagining directly, because it captures something the earlier chapters on oxygen and wind and cold don't quite convey on their own. Reaching the upper flanks of this alternate mountain wouldn't just be dangerous, it would be visually, sensorially unlike anything the real Everest, or any other genuinely climbable mountain on the planet actually offers. A summit standing not just above the clouds, which the real Everest already manages on clear days, but very nearly above the meaningful atmosphere itself, where the ordinary daytime sky most people never think twice about would have quietly given way to something that looks, for all practical purposes, like a glimpse of space. There's a certain vertigo in imagining that view, a summit where the ground beneath your boots is unmistakably part of the earth, solid rock that was once an ocean floor, and yet the sky overhead looks like something else entirely, borrowed from a domain most human beings only ever see from inside an aircraft cabin, or through the small round window of a spacecraft. Whatever this alternate world's relationship with its tallest mountain eventually became, it's difficult to imagine that particular, singular view not becoming part of the mountain's mythology in its own right, a fixed point where the ordinary sky simply runs out, whether or not anyone ever actually stood there long enough to describe it firsthand. Chapter 14. The Plains That Never Flew Over. There's a real historical episode worth bringing into this alternate story, because it illustrates just how directly the real Everest's actual height has shaped technological history, and how differently that history would very plausibly have unfolded against a considerably taller peak. In 1933, a British expedition backed by the Houston family sent 2 specially modified biplanes over the real Everest summit, an early and genuinely audacious demonstration that powered flight could clear the highest point on Earth. The aircraft, open-cockpit biplanes fitted with supplemental oxygen systems for their crews and heated flight suits to survive temperatures well below freezing at altitude, flew directly over the summit at a height only narrowly exceeding it, close enough that photographs taken from the cockpit that day remain some of the earliest aerial images ever captured of the mountain's actual summit ridge. It was, at the time, considered a serious test of aviation technology, proof that human-built machines could operate reliably at altitudes that would kill an unprotected person within minutes, a genuine milestone in the broader history of high-altitude flight that fed directly into the design considerations for later aircraft, including, eventually, the pressurized cabins that make modern commercial aviation practical at all. An Everest standing nearly twice as tall would have pushed that same milestone dramatically further out of reach for the technology of the 1930s. This is speculation grounded directly in real historical aviation capability rather than invented from nothing. Aircraft of that era, even specially modified for the attempt, were operating close to their absolute practical ceiling in clearing the real Everest's roughly 9-kilometre summit, and reaching an altitude of nearly 18 kilometres deep into stratospheric territory was genuinely beyond what any aircraft of the 1930s, however cleverly modified, could plausibly achieve. In this alternate timeline, flying over the roof of the world almost certainly wouldn't have happened until decades later, likely not until the jet age had matured considerably, with pressurized cabins and engines capable of sustained operation at far higher altitudes than propeller aircraft of the interwar period could manage, pushing this particular aviation milestone from the 1930s into perhaps the 1950s or 1960s, whenever aircraft genuinely capable of comfortably operating near 18 kilometres first became available. This has a curious ripple effect worth naming. The real 1933 Houston Everest flight fed directly into public and scientific enthusiasm about high-altitude aviation, at a moment when the field was still young, contributing to broader momentum toward the pressurized, oxygen-supplied aircraft designs that eventually made both commercial jet travel and high-altitude military reconnaissance practical. A world where that particular milestone gets delayed by 2 or 3 decades might very plausibly have seen a correspondingly delayed, or at least differently sequenced path towards some of those same later aviation technologies, though this is genuinely speculative territory, layering one counterfactual on top of another in a way that becomes harder to defend with confidence the further we extend it. What we can say more directly is that the summit of our alternate mountain would have remained for a meaningfully longer stretch of the 20th century than the real Everest's summit ever did, a place no human-built machine had ever passed directly over, let alone a place any person had ever stood. There's something fitting in that delay, tying back to everything we've discussed about the mountain's relationship with the edge of the breathable atmosphere. A peak that pushes this close to the boundary between mountaineering and aerospace wouldn't just challenge the climbers trying to walk up it. It would challenge, and for decades genuinely outpace, the aircraft trying to fly over it too, a summit that spent much of the 20th century equally out of reach from both directions at once. Chapter 15. Life at the Edges. Let's return for a final chapter before we bring this all together to the living world clinging to the slopes of this mountain, because life's relationship with extreme altitude is more intricate and more resilient than most people assume, and it's worth understanding properly before we imagine how it stretches to fit a considerably taller peak. On the real Everest, vegetation persists further up the mountain than most people expect. True forest, rhododendron and birch and fir gives way gradually to alpine shrubland, then to sparse cushion plants and lichens clinging to bare rock, with documented flowering plants found growing at elevations above 6,000 metres, an altitude where the air holds less than half the oxygen available at sea level, and where nighttime temperatures regularly plunge well below freezing even in the height of summer. These aren't hardy exceptions to some hard vegetation ceiling. They're evidence that the actual limit on plant life at altitude is considerably higher than casual intuition suggests, constrained more by soil stability, growing season length, and water availability than by cold or thin air alone, at least up to a point. Animal life pushes the boundary further still. Himalayan jumping spiders have been documented at elevations exceeding 6,500 metres, apparently sustaining themselves on wind-blown insects carried up from lower elevations by mountain updrafts, an ecosystem existing almost entirely on nutrients imported from far below rather than anything produced locally. Bar-headed geese, remarkably, migrate directly over the Himalayan range during their seasonal journeys, flying at altitudes that put them briefly into the same thin air found near the real Everest summit, sustained by a suite of physiological adaptations, unusually efficient hemoglobin, specialized lung structures that allow them to extract enough oxygen from air most other birds, let alone mammals, simply couldn't survive breathing while exerting themselves in sustained flight. A taller version of this same range, building the kind of extended high-altitude zone we discussed several chapters back, would very plausibly have offered both more total habitat at extreme elevation and a correspondingly more demanding upper boundary for whatever life attempted to occupy it. This is speculation extending real, documented altitudinal life zones rather than invented from nothing. The specific plants and small, cold-adapted animals that populate the real Everest's upper reaches would very plausibly have found analogous, if perhaps somewhat different, niches available across a taller alternate range's correspondingly larger high-altitude zone, an even wider vertical band of alpine tundra and rock desert, supporting whatever combination of hardy cushion plants, lichens, and the small invertebrates and birds that feed on wind-blown debris could push their own physiological limits to match. Where the line would very plausibly draw sharper than it does on the real mountain is somewhere in the upper reaches, well below the actual summit, where the same thin air, extreme cold constraints we've discussed for human physiology would eventually catch up with even the most extraordinarily adapted organisms. Bar-headed geese might well fly somewhat higher over this alternate range than they do over the real Himalayas, pushed by the same evolutionary pressures that already let them clear the actual mountains, but even their remarkable physiology has practical limits, and the truly uppermost reaches of an 18-kilometer peak, deep in the thin, jet stream-scoured territory we discussed a few chapters back, would very plausibly have remained as sterile and lifeless as the real Everest summit already is, a zone where rock, ice, and wind exist without a single living thing to witness them, on this mountain exactly as it already is on the one we actually have. What changes then isn't really the presence or absence of a hard biological ceiling, since the real Everest already has one, somewhere above the last hardy lichen and below the summit itself. What changes is simply how much more mountain exists above that ceiling in our alternate timeline, a considerably larger stretch of genuinely lifeless, wind-scoured rock and ice standing above the highest point any plant or animal could plausibly reach, an even starker, more extended transition from a living mountain to a purely mineral one than the real Everest already presents, the boundary between life and its absence pushed higher, but no less absolute than it already is today. Chapter 16, The Question of the Summit. The rains of a reorganised monsoon, the winds of a permanent jet stream, the rivers running larger out of larger ice, the aircraft arriving decades late, the 14 peaks that never became a meaningful list at all. None of it required anything exotic to set in motion, only the same ordinary forces already at work on the real mountain, tipped slightly further in one direction and given enough time to compound. Here's a strange thought to close on. In the world we're imagining tonight, the tallest point on the surface of the Earth has never felt a human footstep. Not Hillary's, not Norgay's, not anyone's. It has simply stood there for tens of millions of years, wrapped in wind and cold and thin hostile air, indifferent to the fact that an entire species capable of eventually walking on the moon never quite managed to walk on it. There's something worth sitting with in that image because it cuts against one of the deeper currents running through human history. The assumption that anything visible, anything reachable in principle, eventually gets reached. Mallory's famous three-word answer to why he wanted to climb the real Everest has outlived almost everything else recorded about those early expeditions, precisely because it captures something true about human ambition generally, the sense that a summit exists, in some sense, to be stood upon, that leaving the highest point on Earth untouched would be a kind of unfinished business the species was always going to eventually settle. Our alternate timeline asks what it would mean if that assumption simply turned out to be wrong, not because of any failure of courage or ingenuity, but because the mountain itself, through nothing more dramatic than ordinary physics, geology, and human biology, sat permanently beyond the line where effort and preparation stopped being able to compensate for a body's basic physical limits. It would be easy to frame that as a loss, a great unclimbed monument standing as a permanent monument to human limitation rather than human achievement. But it's worth resisting that framing, the same way we resisted it a few chapters back when we talked about what desert-adapted cultures might have looked like in a different documentary, about a different landscape entirely. A mountain that remains genuinely beyond reach isn't diminished by that fact. If anything, it holds on to something, the real Everest, for all its continuing danger and difficulty, has necessarily surrendered a little of over the past 70 years. The specific total mystery of a place no one has ever actually stood, photographed from the summit ridge, or described from direct immediate experience. Every real Everest expedition since 1953 has climbed a mountain that previous humans have already reached, already mapped in exhaustive detail, already described from the inside. Our alternate peak would remain permanently exactly as unknowable at its true summit as it was the day the first curious person looked up at it from the valley floor and wondered what was actually up there. There's a broader point buried in this specific mountain that's worth carrying forward into how we think about limits generally. We tend to treat physical limits, the edge of what a human body can survive, the edge of what a structure can bear, the edge of what a system can sustain, as obstacles to be eventually overcome with enough ingenuity and enough time. Sometimes that's true, but sometimes a limit is simply a limit, a genuine boundary condition built into the physics of how things work, no more negotiable than the compressive strength of rock or the amount of oxygen a human brain needs to keep functioning. Our alternate Everest sits close to, or arguably past, one of the genuine structural limits of what a mountain on this planet can be, and its unclimbed summit, in this telling, sits close to, or arguably past, one of the genuine limits of what an unaided human body can reach. Neither limit is a failure of anything. They're simply the shape of the world as it actually is, or in tonight's case, as it might very plausibly have been. There's a broader point buried in this specific mountain that's worth carrying forward into how we think about limits generally. We tend to treat physical limits, the edge of what a human body can survive, the edge of what a structure can bear, the edge of what a system can sustain, as obstacles to be eventually overcome with enough ingenuity and enough time. Sometimes that's true, but sometimes a limit is simply a limit, a genuine boundary condition built into the physics of how things work, no more negotiable than the compressive strength of rock or the amount of oxygen a human brain needs to keep functioning. Our alternate Everest sits close to, or arguably past, one of the genuine structural limits of what a mountain on this planet can be. And its unclimbed summit, in this telling, sits close to, or arguably past, one of the genuine limits of what an unaided human body can reach. Neither limit is a failure of anything. They're simply the shape of the world as it actually is, or in tonight's case as it might very plausibly have been. Consider too everything this single number, roughly double the real mountain's actual height, has touched across tonight's telling. An atmosphere thin enough to border on space, a wind pattern locked into permanent hurricane force, a monsoon reorganized across an entire subcontinent, an aviation milestone delayed by decades, an entire category of human achievement, the 14 8,000ers, quietly dissolved before it ever had the chance to exist. All of it traces back to the same simple ratio between uplift and erosion, tipped just far enough in one direction, sustained for just long enough to push one particular peak considerably closer to the outer edge of what geology on this planet is willing to allow. So, as you drift off, picture it one last time. A peak rising out of cloud far above where the real Everest summit sits, its upper slopes lost in a permanent haze of wind-blown snow, catching the last direct sunlight of the day long after the valleys below have already gone dark, the way only the very highest points on Earth do, somewhere far beneath it, in villages and cities across an entire subcontinent shaped, in ways large and small, by the mountain's height, its rivers, its rain, its wind, its very presence on the horizon. People are settling in for the night, the same way you are right now, under the same darkening sky. The mountain doesn't know it's never been climbed. It doesn't know anything at all, no more than the real Everest does, no more than any arrangement of rock and ice anywhere on this planet ever has. It simply stands there, the way it has for 50 million years, the way it will for millions more, the tallest thing on the surface of a small spinning planet, entirely unconcerned with whether anyone ever finds a way to stand on top of it. The rock that formed it was ocean floor once, tens of millions of years before anyone existed to imagine climbing it at all. Patient and indifferent then. Patient and indifferent now. Exactly as it would have been whichever version of this story actually happened to come true. And here you are, drifting towards sleep, at the bottom of an ocean of air the mountain's true summit has never once had to breathe.